The photograph is dated 1871. The caption reads, "St. Louis Riverfront, post-war recovery." The street is wide enough for 4 modern lanes. Stone viaducts rise behind it, their arches clean, mathematically spaced. Rail lines run straight toward the horizon. There are no crowds, no carts, no laborers, no debris, just infrastructure, finished, silent, waiting. According to the 1870 US Census, St. Louis was home to over 310,000 people by this point, a booming industrial city, rail hub of the continent. Yet the photograph shows emptiness, not construction, not abandonment, but absence. The rails are already there, the buildings are already there, the people are not. On the reverse side of the print, in pencil, someone wrote, "View taken before occupation." Before occupation by whom? If railways are meant to be built to meet demand, why do they so often appear as if demand arrived later? And what if these rails were not constructed, but inherited? By the mid-19th century, we are told, railroads exploded outward from industrial centers. Steam power, private capital, immigrant labor, and national ambition converged. America, Europe, and Russia laid track at unprecedented speed, and the textbook narrative is familiar, even comforting. The transcontinental railroad was completed in 1869. Britain had a dense rail web by the 1850s. Russia expanded eastward through the 1890s. Photographs from the era show proud locomotives, posed workers, ceremonial spikes driven into virgin ground. And on paper, the mathematics appears sound. With thousands of miles built per year, millions of workers migrating westward, iron and timber flowing endlessly from newly opened forests and foundries. Yet even within this accepted chronicle, subtle tensions emerge for those willing to examine the evidence closely. Rail lines appear before population density in many regions. Stations are overbuilt for their supposed markets. Bridges span rivers that serve no immediate economic purpose. At first glance, this seems like optimism, like nation building, like the confident reach of industrial civilization into wilderness. But optimism leaves traces of effort. Nation building leaves disorder. Expansion leaves the messy evidence of construction, temporary camps, tool marks, spoil piles, the accumulated debris of human labor. Yet when we examine early railway photographs, that disorder is often conspicuously absent. The infrastructure appears not emerging, but emerged, not becoming, but complete. Perhaps this is merely selective photography, moments captured after cleanup. Or perhaps the traces we expect to find were never there to begin with. Railway company ledgers from the 1840s through the 1870s describe heroic labor on an unprecedented scale. Census records emphasize immigration waves bringing millions to new lands. Promotional pamphlets boast of opening the frontier and conquering distance. These documents paint a picture of rapid, ambitious construction, industrial civilization pushing into untamed territory. Yet when early railway photographs are placed beside these written claims, the alignment falters in troubling ways. Take the 1868 Union Pacific promotional album produced to attract investors and settlers. The images show pristine cuts through bedrock, perfect ballast grading extending for miles, and no visible spoil piles, despite massive excavation. Or consider the Russian Imperial Railway photographic plates from the 1860s, showing stone embankments of impressive height extending into a sparsely populated steppe, their construction predating any recorded settlement in the region. The documents consistently describe speed, rapid construction, accelerated timelines, and compressed schedules. The images consistently suggest something else. Precision, completeness, a kind of readiness that seems to precede use. Precision implies extensive planning. Planning implies comprehensive prior surveying. And surveying implies knowledge, sometimes knowledge that appears to predate the official timeline by decades if not longer. An 1847 surveyor's report from the Illinois Prairie notes finding stone foundations of unusual character along a proposed rail route. The foundations were incorporated into the line. Their origin was never determined. The report was filed and forgotten. Perhaps this discrepancy between written record and photographic evidence means nothing. Perhaps it merely reflects the natural gap between documentation and reality, between what is described and what can be captured on a glass plate. Or perhaps it suggests something more unsettling, that the documents describe activation rather than creation, occupation rather than construction. Period newspapers, when examined closely, occasionally betray moments of unease that complicate the triumphant narrative of railway expansion. An 1872 bulletin from an Illinois Railway Commission remarks, almost in passing, "The line appears curiously advanced for a territory yet unsettled. The observation is never developed. It stands alone in the report, a fragment of doubt quickly buried beneath statistics and optimistic projections." Similarly, an engineer's journal from Bohemia, dated 1861, describes encountering stone railbeds of unknown origin during track upgrades near Prague. The engineer notes that these foundations required no additional work, merely clearing and the placement of rails. He expresses puzzlement, but not alarm. After all, practical men do not question good fortune. In Russian archives, a construction supervisor's log from 1889 mentions pre-existing embankments along a section of the Trans-Siberian route. The entry is brief, bureaucratic, unremarkable, except for what it implies, that substantial earthworks existed before the official survey, before the approved route, before construction supposedly began. These fragments never become headlines. They are absorbed into the larger narrative of progress, dismissed as curiosities or clerical errors. To question their origin would be to question the story we tell ourselves about who civilized whom, about who built the modern world and when. The alternative, that these systems might predate our understanding of their construction, challenges not just industrial history, but the entire chronology of the 19th century. And chronology, once destabilized, threatens everything built upon it. So the observations remain scattered across forgotten archives, disconnected data points that never coalesce into a pattern, until perhaps one chooses to connect them. Industrialization, we are consistently told, explains everything. Capital accumulation explains everything. Immigration and labor explain everything. And individually, taken in isolation, these explanations do satisfy. They offer coherent mechanisms, plausible causation, the comfortable logic of material progress. Textbooks present railway expansion as the natural outcome of converging forces: steam technology, surplus capital seeking investment, political will, available labor, and raw materials. The equation balances, the narrative closes, yet history does not fracture neatly into isolated phenomena. It accumulates. Patterns layer upon patterns, and what accumulates here, beneath the official explanations, is a quiet but persistent discomfort, a sense that something essential is missing from the frame. When a rail line appears fully operational in a region, census records show as virtually unpopulated the previous decade, we invoke immigration. When stations of improbable grandeur emerge in territories officially described as frontier, we invoke optimistic speculation. When photographic evidence shows completion where ledgers describe ongoing construction, we invoke documentary lag. Each explanation, considered alone, seems reasonable, but reasonable explanations do not typically require such frequent invocation. A complete explanation should not leave so many gaps requiring supplementary justification. Perhaps this discomfort is merely the natural friction between simplified historical narrative and messy reality. Or perhaps it signals something more fundamental, that we are mistaking activation for creation, occupation for construction, inheritance for achievement. The rails were built, we are told. The evidence whispers otherwise. It whispers that they were found, cleared, reactivated, that the 19th century did not construct these continental systems but discovered them, integrated them, brought them back into use. This remains speculation. But it is speculation that grows more coherent with each accumulated anomaly, with each photograph that shows too much precision and too little disorder, with each census gap that migration cannot adequately explain. Examine construction photographs from India in the 1850s, specifically those documenting the Great Indian Peninsula Railway. Miles of elevated stone viaducts stretch across terrain where quarry sites remain undocumented in colonial records. The viaducts themselves display a construction technique, massive interlocking stones without visible mortar, that official histories attribute to contemporary British engineering. Yet similar structures in Britain from the same period show entirely different construction methods: smaller stones, extensive mortar, visible tool marks consistent with 19th century quarrying. The contrast is striking and suggests a different build approach. The Indian viaducts show weathering patterns that suggest far greater age than their supposed construction date in the 1850s. Stone erodes predictably. These arches show erosion consistent with centuries, not decades. Similarly, in Siberia, early photographic documentation of the Trans-Siberian Railway reveals embankments of Cyclopean stone appearing long before mechanized excavation equipment was available in the region. Photographs from 1892 show perfectly graded earthworks extending through territory where labor camps are not visible, where temporary infrastructure is absent, where the evidence of recent construction simply does not appear. Labor should be visible in these images. Temporary camps should dot the landscape. Scaffolding should appear in images of bridge construction. Tool marks should scar the stone. Spoil piles should accumulate beside excavations. The disorder of active construction should pervade these scenes. Instead, across continents, across decades of railway photography, we see permanence. We see arches that appear weathered as if already ancient. We see grading that suggests centuries of settling rather than recent placement. We see completion where we should see process. Official records describe these railways as built between 1850 and 1900. The photographic evidence presents infrastructure that appears far older, merely cleared of vegetation and reactivated for use. Perhaps early photographers simply chose to capture only the finished sections, avoiding the mess of active construction zones. Or perhaps there was no mess to avoid. Perhaps restoration requires less disorder than creation. Rail hubs, according to economic logic, should correlate with population growth. Infrastructure follows demand. Cities grow, then rail connections emerge to serve that growth. This is the standard model of urban industrial development, and it explains most modern transportation networks adequately. Yet census records from the mid-19th century repeatedly show the inverse pattern. St. Louis provides the clearest example. By 1870, the city possessed rail density far exceeding its population requirements. Multiple trunk lines converged on the city, vast switching yards stood largely empty, and passenger terminals of cathedral-like proportions served relatively modest traffic. Population growth surged after 1870, not before. The infrastructure preceded the population it supposedly served. Omsk, in western Siberia, presents a similar contradiction. By 1890, it functioned as a major rail junction with extensive facilities, yet urban density remained minimal. Census records show fewer than 40,000 residents, hardly justifying the scale of railway infrastructure present. Population exploded after 1900, decades after the rail capacity was established. In South America, the outskirts of Buenos Aires show vast rail grids, preceding housing development by years, sometimes decades. Photographs from 1888 reveal extensive track networks radiating into empty prairie, with stations built but no communities visible. The conventional explanation suggests speculative development, building infrastructure to attract population. But speculation requires capital, and capital requires projected returns. These rail networks show investment far exceeding reasonable speculation. They suggest not optimistic building but patient waiting. In some cases, populations surge dramatically after rail systems activate, not after construction, but after activation, as if the rails themselves triggered migration rather than responded to it. This raises an unsettling question that census data cannot answer. Who were these continental rail systems waiting for? Were they built for populations that had not yet arrived, or were they remnants of systems built for populations that had already departed? Grand terminals emerge with improbable timing across the globe, their architecture defying the economic logic of gradual development. Antwerp Central Station, begun in 1895, rises as a cathedral-scale monument in a city whose population and traffic hardly justified such grandeur at the time. The station's stone vaulting, intricate ironwork, and massive central dome suggest construction capacity and aesthetic ambition that seem disconnected from the utilitarian needs of a regional rail hub. Mumbai's Chhatrapati Shivaji Terminus, completed in 1887, displays Gothic mastery that official records attribute to British architect Frederick William Stevens. Yet the building incorporates architectural techniques, stone carving, vault construction, and spatial organization that appear suddenly in the historical record without the gradual development typically seen in architectural evolution. The structure dominates its surroundings not as a functional station, but as a monument built to impress rather than merely serve. Helsinki Central Station presents perhaps the most troubling chronology. While official records date its completion to 1919, architectural historians note that its foundations show characteristics inconsistent with early 20th century construction methods. The stonework at the base displays weathering and technique more commonly associated with much older structures. Renovation, not original construction, better describes what occurred in the early 1900s. These are not utilitarian sheds erected quickly to meet immediate transportation needs. They are monuments, permanent, imposing, designed for permanence and crowds. Yet in most cases they were built before the crowds existed, before the traffic justified them. These structures stood long before the cities around them had grown to proportions that would require such scale. Monumental architecture usually marks culmination, the final expression of accumulated wealth and established need. It represents arrival, not departure. Success, not speculation. Yet these railway terminals function as monuments to populations that had not yet arrived, to traffic volumes that would not exist for decades, to an urban density that remained years or generations away. What civilization builds monuments before it has citizens to fill them? What logic drives the construction of cathedrals for ghost congregations? Across continents, separated by thousands of miles, and documented by different photographers using different equipment and techniques, early railway photography shares a single, persistent motif: emptiness. The platforms are empty. The streets leading to stations are empty. The grand concourses, designed for thousands, stand silent and unpopulated. Conventional explanation points to long exposure times required by early photographic technology. Movement creates blur, so early photographs naturally capture only static elements: buildings, rails, empty streets. People, being mobile, simply do not appear. This explanation satisfies when examining a single photograph. It becomes less convincing when examining hundreds, because emptiness and blur are not the same phenomenon. Long exposures blur movement, they do not erase presence. If trains were running regularly, If stations were functioning as intended, if commerce was flowing through these rail hubs, then someone should be visible waiting. Even with primitive equipment and exposure times measuring in seconds, stationary figures should appear, passengers waiting for trains, workers pausing between tasks, vendors stationed at their posts. But they do not appear. The photographs show not blur, suggesting movement just outside the frame, but absence, suggesting no movement at all. An 1873 photograph of Chicago's Union Station shows empty platforms extending into the distance, perfect in their geometric precision, utterly devoid of human presence. An 1881 image of London's St. Pancras captures the Gothic arches of the terminus rising above empty tracks. An 1895 photograph of the Trans-Siberian Railway station at Irkutsk reveals platforms, canopies, signage, everything except people. Individually, each image might be dismissed as a carefully chosen moment, a photographer's aesthetic preference for architectural documentation over human activity. Collectively, they form a pattern that long exposure times cannot adequately explain. Silence can be evidence, absence can testify. And what these photographs testify to across decades and continents is infrastructure without inhabitants, not infrastructure being built, not infrastructure abandoned, but infrastructure waiting. These images feel less like documentation of active systems and more like archaeological records of something that existed before the photograph, before the photographer, perhaps before the century itself. Individually, each anomaly encountered thus far can be dismissed. Long exposures explain empty photographs. Optimistic speculation explains overbuilt stations. Efficient construction explains rapid railway completion. Archival gaps explain missing quarry documentation. Immigration explains sudden population surges. Documentary lag explains discrepancies between written records and photographic evidence. Each explanation considered in isolation holds, yet history is not experienced in isolation. Evidence accumulates, patterns emerge, and what emerges here with increasing clarity is an alignment that coincidence cannot adequately explain. Rails consistently appear before populations dense enough to justify them. Stations manifest as monuments before communities exist to fill them. Precision appears before industrial capacity officially existed to achieve it. Photographic evidence shows completion, where documentary evidence describes construction. Census records show demographic surges following rail activation rather than preceding it. Stone weathering suggests age far exceeding official construction dates. Across different continents, under different political systems, within different economic contexts, the same sequence repeats. Infrastructure first, population later. System first, users later. Completion first, occupation later. This is not the pattern of gradual development. It is not the signature of industrial expansion. It is not the rhythm of civilization spreading outward from centers of power and wealth. It is something else entirely, a pattern suggesting not construction, but reactivation, not creation, but restoration. The evidence does not prove this interpretation. Evidence rarely proves alternative historical narratives, but it consistently points toward a possibility that conventional explanations struggle to accommodate, that the 19th century railway boom was not boom at all, but reactivation, that the great age of rail construction was actually an age of rail restoration, that what we call building might more accurately be called finding, clearing, and putting back into service systems that already existed in some form, dormant, overgrown, waiting. The question transforms. It is no longer how were continental railway systems built so quickly, but rather when were they originally built, and what happened to the civilization that built them. This remains speculation, pattern recognition, seeking coherence. But patterns, once perceived, cannot be unseen, and this pattern, woven through census records and photographs and architectural anomalies, whispers a chronology that does not match the textbooks. Rail systems across continents activate within the same narrow decades, roughly 1840 through 1900, despite operating under vastly different political, economic and technological conditions. Britain, a naval and industrial superpower, lays extensive track. Russia, still predominantly feudal, pushes rails across Siberia. The United States, recovering from civil war, completes transcontinental lines. India, under colonial administration, develops vast networks. Argentina, newly independent, builds systems radiating from Buenos Aires. These nations share neither political structure nor economic development level nor technological capacity. Yet they share timing, and they share more than timing. The geometry matches across continents. Track gauges standardize with remarkable speed, as if following a template rather than developing independently. The engineering solutions echo one another. Similar viaduct construction, similar grading techniques, similar station architecture, appearing in regions with no direct communication or technological exchange. Stone archways in India mirror stone archways in Europe. Embankments in Siberia resemble embankments in Argentina. The architectural language repeats with variations that suggest not independent invention, but regional adaptation of a common source. Most strikingly, the scale matches. These are not tentative experimental systems gradually expanded as success proves viability. They are continental from inception, ambitious beyond immediate need, extensive beyond current population, permanent beyond speculative necessity. Official histories explain this synchronization through the Industrial Revolution and information exchange, steam power and steel production enabling rapid expansion, with telegraph and shipping allowing techniques to spread globally. But information exchange explains variation as much as similarity. Independent adaptation produces divergence. Shared templates produce convergence. And what the global rail system shows is convergence, geometric, architectural, temporal. This pattern suggests not independent industrial revolutions occurring simultaneously across continents, but rather coordinated activation of existing systems. Not invention spreading outward from Britain, but rediscovery occurring simultaneously across formerly connected regions. The implications resist easy acceptance. They require reimagining the 19th century not as an age of unprecedented construction, but as an age of inheritance. A period when scattered populations, perhaps rebuilt after some unspecified catastrophe, reoccupied infrastructure left by a prior civilization. The rails did not spread civilization. They marked where civilization had already been. Between 1854 and 1929, the Orphan train movement transported an estimated 250,000 children from eastern cities to rural destinations, primarily along expanding rail corridors. Orphan movements reshaped human geography along steel lines. Official histories describe this as charitable relocation, urban orphanages overwhelmed by immigration and poverty, sending children west to families needing farm labor. The narrative is humanitarian, rescuing children from overcrowded institutions and giving them opportunities in growing communities. Yet when examined against census records and intake documentation, troubling patterns emerge. Foundling hospitals surged near major rail terminals during this exact period. Intake records show massive numbers of children with no family history, no documentation of parents, no clear origin. Parents unknown, origins uncertain, records unavailable. Unknown appears repeatedly in the archives. New York alone, between 1865 and 1875, over 30,000 children entered institutional care with no documented parentage. Immigration records do not account for these numbers. Birth records do not explain them. The children simply appear in institutional records as if manifesting without genealogical connection to any established population. The orphan trains follow rail lines with remarkable precision. They distribute children along newly activated corridors, placing them in communities that often appear in census records only after the railways begin operation. The trains operate less like charitable redistribution and more like systematic repopulation, filling empty infrastructure with human inhabitants. Repopulation follows the rails. Photographs from receiving communities show children arranged in groups, often dozens at a time, presented to potential families at train stations. The images share the same emptiness as other railway photographs from the period: vast platforms, grand stations, and small groups of children standing in spaces designed for far larger crowds. Empty frames and empty towns appear together. Official explanation maintains charitable intent, providing homes for orphans while supplying labor to frontier families. But charity does not typically operate with such geographic precision, following infrastructure rather than need, nor does charity usually involve such massive demographic displacement, such systematic erasure of family history, such coordinated distribution along specific corridors. Charity alone does not fully explain the pattern. Repopulation requires pathways. The railways provided those pathways, and the orphans, thousands upon thousands with no verifiable origins, provided the population. For infrastructure built before populations existed, children without histories become ideal inhabitants for an empty network. What if a prior civilization collapsed, leaving physical infrastructure largely intact, but erasing the population that created it? What if the 19th century represents not construction, but reoccupation, a period when scattered survivors or newcomers reactivated systems they did not build, repurposed architecture they did not design, and settled into cities that predated their arrival? This hypothesis, speculative but increasingly coherent, reframes every anomaly examined thus far. Rails appear before populations because they existed before populations. Stations function as monuments because they were monuments, built by and for a civilization of different scale and purpose. Photographs show emptiness because the infrastructure genuinely was empty during reactivation, functional but not yet filled. Orphans without origins become settlers without histories, placed into systems that required inhabitants but could not produce them organically. Census gaps reflect not poor record-keeping but actual demographic discontinuity, a break between whoever built these systems and whoever now operates them. The synchronization of global rail activation reflects not industrial revolutions spreading outward, but coordinated reactivation occurring simultaneously as scattered populations reach sufficient organization to restore continental networks. The weathered stone, the archaic construction techniques, the precision beyond supposed technological capacity all become evidence not of rapid 19th century achievement, but of inheritance from an earlier period. A reset explains speed, it explains scale, it explains the silence in the photographs, the perfection without disorder, the completion without visible construction. It explains why industrial capacity seems to spring fully formed rather than develop gradually. It explains architectural sophistication appearing without the centuries of development typically required to achieve such mastery. Most disturbingly, it explains the genealogical gaps, the missing records, the orphans without origins and cities without founding populations. If the 19th century reoccupied rather than created, then everyone living in these reactivated systems becomes, in a sense, an inheritor, without clear title, a resident of infrastructure built by others, for others, under circumstances now obscured or erased. This remains a hypothesis, not proven history, but it offers coherence where conventional narratives offer only disconnected explanations. And coherence, once achieved, becomes difficult to abandon. If infrastructure predates the populations claiming to have built it, then genealogy fractures. Ancestry assumes continuity, an unbroken chain connecting present to past through documented lineage. But what happens when that chain shows gaps that immigration cannot explain, when census records reveal populations appearing rather than arriving, when orphan intake logs show thousands with no verifiable origin. Identity becomes unmoored. The question, "Who are my ancestors?" transforms into "Whose infrastructure am I occupying?" Family histories researched through census and immigration records encounter sudden walls, generations that appear in one census but have no documentation in previous decades, surnames that emerge without clear origin, family trees that trace backward only to a certain point before dissolving into archival absence. These gaps are typically attributed to lost records, clerical errors, the natural disorder of 19th century documentation. But when gaps appear systematically across continents, concentrated in the same decades that show railway activation and orphan surges, a pattern emerges. Perhaps we are not descendants of builders, but inhabitants of what was built, residents in someone else's architecture, operators of someone else's systems, beneficiaries of infrastructure we inherited rather than created. This possibility undermines foundational assumptions about cultural identity, national pride, and technological achievement. It suggests that the civilization we claim as ancestry might itself be an act of occupation, that our connection to the infrastructure we inhabit might be one of discovery rather than creation. The implications extend beyond individual genealogy to collective identity. If the 19th century narrative of industrial achievement is actually a narrative of reactivation, then who were we reactivating it from? What happened to them? And most troubling, could it happen again? Descent assumes continuity. But when examined closely through census gaps, orphan records, and photographic silence, that continuity appears less certain than we have been taught. Infrastructure remains, population cycles, and between cycles perhaps lies the silence we see in those early photographs. Empty rails waiting, empty stations ready, empty streets prepared for occupation by whoever comes next.